Hello and welcome to part 3 of our STAAR review for U.S. history. This is going to cover the content that ranges from World War I to the Cold War. You should have already watched the two videos over the two previous parts of U.S. history and are following along in the packet. Again, I'm going to move pretty fast. I'm going to go through the questions quickly. What you should probably do is pause if I'm moving too quickly for you, go back, listen. Again, I'm here for tutoring, other things like that if there's something that you need more explanation on. So let's go ahead and get started. So, World War II starts in Europe, really with the rise of dictators. We talked about because of a global depression, because of various things that are going on. In a time of insecurity, people want strong leaders. So Hitler rises to power in Germany, Mussolini in Italy, and Tojo in Japan. This cartoon sort of characterizes as they get together and they start to make alliances, deciding how they're going to split the world because they are all rather expansionist. The United States stays out of the war for quite a while. It starts when Hitler invades Poland, but we're able to stay out of it for quite a while. However, much like in World War I, where we were not in the war, but we're kind of in the war because of like economic ties, the same thing is happening. We start various programs that are helping out the Allies, and the Axis powers are not too terribly pleased about this. So the causes of World War II, again, rise of dictators, German-Soviet invasion of Poland, caused the Allies to declare war. U.S., like I said, really attempts to be neutral. They start the cash carry program, which says, like, you can buy stuff so long as you bring cash money to pay for it and take your own ship, because we're wary of that Lusitania stuff that brought us into World War I. However, as basically France is conquered and then various other nations are falling, Britain is under the Blitz, basically we decide, hey, we got to help them out in some way. And so the Lend-Lease plan says, you know, we're going to lend you or lease to you the various weapons of war. To the Germans, to the Japanese, this appears like we've basically taken a side, which kind of we have, and really shows that we're not too terribly neutral. Additionally, remember, we have like the Flying Tigers that are helping to protect the Chinese from the Japanese, and so we are doing actions that could be considered not neutral in this time period. So after Japan attacks Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941, we declare war on both Japan and Germany. Roosevelt decides to go ahead and start attacking in Europe first because of that letter that we read where he said that, you know, it would be a shame if we, you know, do all this stuff in the Pacific front and then wake up to find that Hitler has dominated all of Europe. Question, answer, question, answer it. Many things occur during World War II. Probably the most tragic, the most horrific is the Holocaust. This goes back to that idea of eugenics, the idea of social Darwinism, that there are certain people that are better than other peoples. And so Hitler's belief that Aryans are superior race led to the imprisonment and murder of millions of people. This is mostly Jewish people, but it was also the Roma, it was also homosexuals. It was basically anyone that did not conform to his ideal of what a true person should be. At the end of the war, Allies liberated the concentration camps, but in the end, you know, millions of people die, and it's considered one of the greatest, like, atrocities in world history. So, because the Soviet Union has come to our side after Hitler betrays Stalin, we have a two-front war. However, the United Kingdom is in no position to invade mainland because they're basically, trying to protect themselves, sort of the Blitz. France has been sort of occupied and taken over by the Germans. So there's not really much that can happen until a land invasion is mounted. So what happens is that the Battle of Normandy is when the Allies really take on the mainland of Europe. So they land at Normandy. It's really important because it opens up that second front, which is going to basically have the Russians working on one front, the Americans, Canadians, British, etc. working on the other to basically drive Hitler into the middle and then eventually squish him. Dwight D. Eisenhower is the supreme commander during this. He will later become president. Very well-respected guy because of his contributions to the Battle of Normandy and his other contributions during World War II. On the Pacific Front, which after VE Day we can really pay attention to, there have been other things going on the Pacific Front. when Pearl Harbor is attacked, we talked about that there were attacks on basically all the bases, all the islands that the United States had occupied. Remember, we got all those islands and various things during the Spanish-American War. So when all these things are occupied, our troops surrender, and in one instance, the Bataan Death March, many U.S. soldiers are forced to march. They're given deplorable conditions as they're marched to their prison, and many die, which this compounded with Pearl Harbor, compounded with other things that are going on, lead to a definite sense of wanting vengeance, of wanting revenge on the Japanese more than anyone else. On the Pacific Front, the turning point is the Battle of Midway. This is the U.S. dealing a really strong blow to the Japanese Navy. It puts the Japanese no longer on the offense, but they're now on the defense, and basically allows the U.S. to start their island hopping campaign, going to island to island to island until they reach mainland Japan. Remember, we talked about that you don't want to just take a random island that your enemies are behind you and in front of you, because then you are facing attackers from all sides. So systematically, each island must be taken so you can continue your supply chain and continue to keep your advance going. Many different groups helped during World War II. Remember, we are still in segregated troop times. Tuskegee Airmen are African American pilots who served in a segregated unit. They serve with great valor and shows that African Americans can work as being skilled troops. Flying Tigers are that secret group of American pilots prior to the American Declaration of War who helped to aid the Chinese from the Japanese. Navajo Code Talkers were the Native Americans who helped transmit messages in the Navajo language. We had talked about that the Enigma machine and various things like this were being used to transmit code. However, code can be broken if it is made by a computer or made by some sort of system like this, because it's based in mathematics. It's based on there being a keyword. However, if it's a language that's evolved over time, it doesn't have strategy like a code would have. Therefore, you basically can't break it. Also, again, random people that you have to know. Vernon Baker awarded the Medal of Honor. He was the only living African American veteran of World War II to ever receive this medal. Okay, so you should be able to answer this question. If you cannot, go back, look, answer. Answer. Okay, so domestically, we are again in a total war, much like we were during World War I. So all of the methods of our country are turned towards this war. So the Office of War Information, the WWII, produced pro-war propaganda to increase civilian involvement. We looked at a ton of cartoons by who would become Dr. Seuss and various other people, really encouraging Americans to play into the effort. We analyzed them. We saw they had ethos, pathos, logos, really focusing on that pathos though. There was a draft, although many people did voluntarily sign up. There was tons of people buying into Liberty bonds so they could feel like they played a role in the effort. Also, victory gardens where people grew their own produce, women in the workplace, rationing, volunteerism, things of this nature. The main effect, though, is that our entire infrastructure that was producing goods was turned back on and is making all the goods for the war effort. Our farms are producing food for the war effort. Everything is being pushed towards it. This is what drives us out of the Great Depression, all of this economic output during the war, because we are, again, the only country not under attack at the moment, so we can run our factories, we can run our various things. Question, answer. Question, answer. Okay, again, you should be able to answer this. If you cannot answer this, go back. All right, so there was some other things going on at home that were not as great. Roosevelt ordered the internment of Japanese Americans because there was a fear that instead of being loyal to America, they were loyal to Japan. This has a lot to do with racism. It has a lot to do with the same sort of mentality that got past the Chinese Exclusion Act. But Executive Order 9066 ordered this forced relocation. It's definitely illegal because it deprives people of civil liberties, but the Supreme Court upholds it because, again, in a time of crisis, we are very willing to give up our civil liberties. So even though it seems like it goes against the Fifth Amendment, that due process of law, Sixth Amendment, etc., Cormasu versus the United States in 1944 upholds it because they say, look, you got to take the public safety of everybody above everything else. This is like that case in 1919, the Snick versus United States, that was about the guy who was protesting the war, where the justice said you can't shout fire in a crowded theater and say that's free speech. Sort of the same thing as here. It's the overall protection of people is paramount. So the war ends officially with the dropping of the atomic bomb. The atomic bomb was part of a secret project called the Manhattan Project to develop the atomic bomb in New Mexico. Einstein really encouraged this technology to be sought out, and Robert Oppenheimer and others were key in designing this weapon. We really only made 3. We had the one that we tested at Los Alamos and then 2 that we dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. These produced the surrender of Japan. Truman decides that it's just to use this because a full-scale invasion of Japan would have cost many American lives. Also showing this show of force, he believes, will basically give a really good bargaining place for the United States and really kind of make people just say, okay, war is over, now let's go to peace. Because you don't really want to initiate war with someone who has a weapon of this mass destructive power. However, this is what's really going to start the Cold War. And we can argue all day about when the Cold War starts. Some people say it is like in August of 1945 when this is dropped. Others say it's in 1946, 1947. But this definitely is the impetus for what is going to become the Cold War and the arms race with the Soviet Union. Okay, question, answer. All right, so major themes of World War II. Normandy opens up a new front in Europe. Midway is the turning point in the Pacific Front. The Office of War Information produces propaganda, helps to coordinate the war effort. The war itself boosts the American economy, pulls us out of the Great Depression, and Truman drops the atomic bomb to save American lives. And again, we can talk all day if this is just, unjust. We did an entire activity over this. But he fundamentally believes that this is why he's doing it. So that's what we got to take it as. Okay, so after World War II, our society. What really changes our society is the GI Bill, aka the Servicemen's Readjustment Act. Basically, this is going to guarantee veterans, GIs coming back from the war, either school, a job, a loan to get a business or a house, and basically set them up in life. If you think about like prior to U.S. history, like you're going to have to pay for all of these things up front. It's going to be a struggle to get this. All of a sudden, a guy comes home, he's 23, 24, and now he has basically his life squared away thanks to the U.S. government. This is going to add to suburbanization, high demand of houses. There's no room in the cities, so people move to the outskirts of the cities. The construction of the highways by Eisenhower is going to help to facilitate this. But this really begins that suburbanization that people will be critical of in the 1960s. We listened to that song Tiny Houses, and it's going to start Tiny Boxes. And it's going to start what we talked about later on as the white flight. This also leads to the baby boom. As people come home, again, they are stable, they're able to marry their sweethearts that they've been writing the entirety of the war. They're now very comfortable, can feel like they can have kids securely, and can have multiple children because they are secure in their prosperity. So we're going to see a huge birth rate increase because during the Depression, obviously, the birth rate was very, very low. Okay, question, should be able to answer it. All right, so one of the major policies of the Cold War is containment policy. We read the letter by Kennan where he basically says that there's this communist conspiracy, they want to take over everything. So the primary goal of the United States is to contain communism, to put a box on it. We have various programs. The Truman Doctrine gives lots of aid to Greece and Turkey, basically to bribe them not to become communist because they are those sort of neutralist nations that are between the two powers. The Marshall Plan contains communism by giving much, much aid to Western Europe to basically rebuilding them. Western Europe's rebuilt within about 10 years of the war thanks to the Marshall Plan money. And basically the theory is that you're going to see how awesome capitalism is and what great things it can get you, so communism is just not going to appeal. We also formed the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, a mutual defense alliance for democratic nations. So if France is attacked, the United States will immediately jump in and help them. In contrast to this, the Soviets devised their Warsaw Pact, which is their mutual defense alliance. Question, answer. Okay, should again be able to answer this. So one of the places that we have a huge struggle over is in Berlin. Remember that after World War II, Germany was divided up into 4 zones. Each of the Allied powers have control over an area. Berlin was randomly divided up into 4 parts as well. Even though it's on what you would consider to be Soviet territory, the city itself has been divided up into 4 pieces. So what happens is the Soviets, because they have troops on the ground, blockade Berlin, not letting the Western allies get in. So they begin this like massive airlift where they're basically sending a new plane every 4 to 5 minutes, just dropping tons of supplies every day for almost a year. The Soviets end up lifting the blockade, and really it shows like just the sheer amount of one, technology, but also resources that the West has that they can use to outspin the Soviet system, which is kind of important because this is going to be a reoccurring theme in the Cold War and is what ultimately is going to end to the end of the Cold War. Okay, Berlin airlift. Question, answer. So back home, we have a second Red Scare. We're fighting communism abroad, therefore communism at home seems incredibly scary. The House Un-American Activities Committee was developed prior to McCarthy to investigate various places where we thought there were communists. Hollywood was one of the places they began to look. There was the Hollywood 10, the Hollywood Blacklist, etc. But Joseph McCarthy really best symbolizes this because he's the most public face of it. He basically needs something to rally behind so he can be reelected senator. So he produces a list of 205 people that he says are communists currently working on our State Department. This is terrifying to us because if our own government is working against us, that's super scary. So he makes this committee. They investigate various things. He doesn't have a lot of evidence. He never produces this list, but people are willing to let him go because they're much too scared to confront him. If you read with The Crucible with either Miss Seiss or Miss Lyons, this is what that is about, is a coded sort of way of talking about this McCarthyist witch hunt. There was some evidence that there were Americans spying for the Soviet Union. The Verona papers, those pumpkin papers confirm this, but there were also innocent casualties in this. We can debate, if the Rosenbergs actually did these things, et cetera, et cetera. But McCarthyism definitely a time of fear and sort of typifies this idea that there is a lot of communist fear in the United States in this time period. Also in this time period, we have a huge arms race. Basically, the idea is that if you can produce more nuclear weapons than the other guy, you're going to win this Cold War and be prepared for the hot war because you're going to have so many weapons, no one will ever dare attack you. This is part of that MAD theory, the mutually assured destruction, that basically Soviets bomb us, we will bomb them also, and basically everybody dies. Therefore, no one wants to die, which starts basically a 20-year game of chicken where both sides don't want to be the one to annihilate everyone, but no one wants to be the first one to flinch first. Space race is also a really interesting part of the Cold War. Again, I would like to spend a month on this, but very briefly, the successful launch of Sputnik in 1957 terrifies Americans because if they can float something above us, they can militarize that and then bomb us from above. So this begins the space race. NASA is founded. We put tons of money into science and math education so that we can win this. Kennedy, when he is elected, is going to pledge to put a man on the moon by the end of the decade, and we ultimately do this. So we're latecomers to the space race, but by 1969, Neil Armstrong walks on the moon, and we triumphantly put a flag on the moon and say that we won the space race. Question, answer. All right, so one of the most terrifying things that happens during this is the Cuban Missile Crisis. Remember that Cuba had been a contentious place. During the Spanish-American War, we fight to free Cuba. Cuba gets its freedom thanks to the Platt Amendment. The United States can't legally operate there. However, most of the people that are running Cuba are somehow connected to the United States. Fidel Castro starts a rebellion. They take over, make it communist, and now they are basically another one of our enemies because we are about all-containing communism. So Kennedy authorizes an invasion, the Bay of Pigs invasion. It goes terribly, terribly wrong, but it definitely pits Castro against us in that he's scared that, we're going to try and take him over, again. So the Cuban Missile Crisis is basically just posturing on both sides. We have missiles in Turkey, and so the Soviets need a place where they can have missiles close to us. Castro is scared that we're going to invade him again, so basically he authorizes the Soviets to put missiles in his country. We find this out, and for 13 days, the United States is petrified that we're about to blow up. Kennedy places a naval blockade, and we come very, very close to nuclear war. In the end, the Soviets withdrew its missiles from Cuba. The U.S. later withdraws its missiles from Turkey, and basically the Kennedy promises the U.S. will never invade Cuba again. But again, a very scary time, which leads people to be like, hey, we can't live like this anymore. Let's be calm. This is where we get that red phone between Moscow and the United States where they can call each other up and be like, hey, do you actually want a nuclear war? No, no, cool, let's not do that then. Question, answer. All right, so domino theory is something that also is going on during this time. People are very petrified that if one country falls to communism, another will as well. This has a lot to do with the containment theory and this idea that basically communism spreads like a disease. It also comes back to a fundamental misunderstanding that many of these countries, it's not that communism is something that they want, but it's that independence from other nations is what they want. So China falls to communism in 1949, which terrifies the United States because this giant power that we really liked has become communist. And then Korea, various other things fall. And so the idea is that you got to stop it from falling, or from a country from falling to communism. Otherwise, basically everything will turn to communism. India is eventually going to be communist, then Europe, then everything, then everybody's communist. So we go to Korea in order to basically keep the North Vietnamese who are communist out of South Vietnam, which is democratic. So the U.S. and the UN get involved in this. It really doesn't result in much except deaths. There's no real territory boundary. In the end, they just kind of call a ceasefire, where Korea is just sort of separated and they decide to start shooting at each other. Things are still very, very tense. We watched that video Inside North Korea, which showed how tense things are still today. So the Korean War in 1950 and 1953 is basically just a quasi-war between the Soviet Union and the United States, where they're fighting basically in a satellite place over this idea of communism versus democracy. This is going to happen again in Vietnam. Vietnam was once a French colony. It won its independence from France. Ho Chi Minh had gone as far as to try and get to Versailles to talk to Wilson to ask him to get the French out of his country. He turns to communism. He wants to basically unite his country under communism. Ngo Dai Diem is the monarchist who wants to remain non-communist. So the United States becomes involved in the Vietnam War to contain the spread of communism in Indochina. We sent advisors as early as the late 1950s, but really it picks up in the 1960s with the firing of the ship on the Gulf of Tonkin. But this domino theory is really what we're using to justify the U.S. involvement in it, because we fear that if Vietnam falls, then everything else will fall to communism as well. The official dates of the Vietnam War are 1964 to 1975. However, again, we could date it a decade earlier, because we have some involvement earlier on. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution is what we traditionally say is like the starting point of it. The USS Maddox claimed it had been attacked by the Viet Cong, the North Vietnamese. This continues that theme of when a ship of ours gets fired on, it kind of leads to war. So in response, the U.S. sends ground troops into Vietnam. Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin resolution to give President Johnson the authority to conduct a war, because remember, it should be Congress doing this under the doctrine of separation of powers and the checks and balances that we have in our system. So this gives the president some kind of like a huge power. And this again is part of that theme of the increasing power of the federal government, the increasing power of the president through the 20th century. So you should answer this. So the Tet Offensive in 1968 was very detrimental to the war effort. Basically, the North Vietnamese attack almost all the major cities in South Vietnam on the same day, and it disproves this idea that America is winning this war. Johnson has been telling everyone that, like, we're doing well, things are great, the Viet Cong are weak, undersupplied, disorganized, low morale. Remember, we're using that body count to show that, hey, we're winning this war really well. But this is what leads to that credibility gap. Basically, Americans are seeing with their eyes that we are not doing too terribly hot in this war, even though our president is saying that we are. So this is leading to that distrust of the government that's been sort of burgeoning through the 20th century, so starting with Teapot Dome and then moving through to this. And really this plus Watergate is what's going to lead to our current, climate where we do not really trust our government too terribly much. So when Nixon is elected in 1968, he's elected in a pretty big landslide. He introduces Vietnamization, where basically the South Vietnamese are going to take over the brunt of the fighting, and allows the U.S. to withdraw. The American people really like this, and the idea of peace with honor is really the term used to describe it, because we don't have a decisive victory, but we just sort of handed the torch over to someone else. The fall of Saigon, when the North Vietnamese take over the capital city of Saigon in South Vietnam, marked the end of the Vietnam War. This is the first time the U.S. ever lost a war. Some people contend whether or not this was a loss, since we kind of backed out before it was over. And some people say, well, maybe Korea was a loss. Also, some people do the hard sell of the War of 1812 was totally not a win either. So take all this with a grain of salt. So the effects. This really leads many in the U.S. to question whether or not we should be the police officer of the world, and makes us think that maybe we should focus on domestic stuff, because remember, this is the heyday of the 1960s and the protests and seeing our own cities on fire, and so focus on ourselves rather than the rest of the world. The 26th Amendment is passed, which lowers the voting age from 21 to 18. This is because of that idea that if you're old enough to fight, if you're old enough to be drafted and to die in a war, you should have the right to vote on that war. Also, the War Powers Act is passed, which basically says that Gulf of Tonkin thing, resolution, not going to happen again. The president can't do these unilateral decisions, and basically restores that system of checks and balances. Okay, question, answer. So the media coverage, this is called the television war. This is the first time the technology is there for reporters to go into the battle with troops and to see these things like at the first happenings. It also isn't being filtered through a giant U.S. propaganda machine like it was during World War II. And so people are like watching these things on TV unfurl, which makes the war extremely unpopular. It also leads to this credibility gap, which shows that like Johnson again is saying we're doing well, but then with your own eyes, you're seeing things not doing well. This leads to the anti-war movement, to seeing the U.S. basically as an invader, things of this nature. The U.S. is incredibly divided this time between those hawks and the doves, but Nixon insists that most people actually support the war because they're that silent majority, that theme that's going to come up again and again. That most Americans are happy with the way that the world is going, they just don't want to say anything about it, because if you're content, you don't really say anything. So counterculture in the 1960s is huge. It starts in the 50s. 50s is not just that conformist culture. The Beats go around writing all kinds of things. Jack Kerouac on the road, living away from this conformist culture. But really it's in the 1960s that we're going to see this break away. These are the kids whose parents were, the greatest generation, like survived the Depression, survived the war. So now their kids are basically reacting against this like lifestyle that's been sort of mapped out for them. They turn their backs on this traditional American culture. They want to make their own society based on peace and love, because they look at the world that their parents have created and all they see are bombs and war and things, and they want to go back to something different. Again, it's that reoccurring theme in U.S. history of kids rebelling against their parents, which happens basically every generation. This is just a very extreme version of it. When Nixon's elected, he decides to calm down the Cold War and leads to a policy of detente. Basically, he thinks that we can't live in this, world where things like the Cuban Missile Crisis can happen anymore. And so he signs various treaties with the Soviets, like SALT I, SALT II, basically to slow down the arms race. He also visits China. Many U.S. presidents have been invited to China. Many of them, however, turn down this because they do not want to go talk to a communist. But this kind of shows like how strongly Nixon feels about it, that he's willing to go to a country that's considered our enemy, which seems fairly dangerous. Reagan, however, revamps that Cold War. Reagan thinks the best way to prevent war is to make America's enemies understand that the U.S. has the means and the will to stop aggression. He totally revamps sort of the MAD rhetoric. He revamps the rhetoric of what he calls peace through strength, where basically by being super strong, we're going to keep everyone from attacking us. He encourages all types of new military technology, like the Strategic Defense Initiative, the Star Wars program that we talked about, and lots of money is spent on this military-industrial complex, developing new weapons and paying for them, which does improve the economy. So question, answer. So the Berlin Wall falls in 1989. Basically, the communists were losing power because they can't hold their nation together. The economy is pretty bad. We now have like new global systems that are emerging that people want to take place in. And really, the Soviets begin to back up and really focus all of their real care in Russia proper. So all of their satellite states start to kind of collapse. And in Germany, basically, over time, there are no soldiers guarding this wall. So people finally, tear it down. This is the major symbol of the end of the Cold War. Nobody in the public really thought that this was going to happen at the time that it did. Pundits were saying just like a couple of days before, like this Cold War is going to last another 10 years. But this basically is seen as pretty much the beginning of the end. A lot of people credit Reagan with it, but however, remember, this happens under George H.W. Bush, and it's probably more due to external factors than and internal factors within Russia or within the Soviet Union, and not so much what American policy is doing. The Cold War officially ends in 1991, and things sort of return to this less escalating process. We start disarmament, things of this nature, and again turn more inward to internal politics. And with the tech boom and everything, the U.S. economy is going to continue to rise, even though we're not spending as much money on military. So major themes of the Cold War: fear and tension. People are in really big fear that they may be bombed in any day. We watched the duck cover videos. We saw all of the fear that people had. There's a huge drive to stop communism wherever it is. So this leads to the Korean War, to the Vietnam War, and to various policies like the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan. The arms race, where we're making weapons just in case. This leads to that MAD theory and various things. And really, it lasts a very long, long time. Again, this is not a declared war. It's just a period of tension from the late 1940s until 1991. All right, so that is it. That is World War I through the Cold War. Hopefully this was a good review. If you have more questions, please come see me during tutoring, and I will talk to you again soon.